Hello everyone and welcome to today's session, Securing Your Cloud Data, Practical Advice to Mitigate Risk. My name is Shannon Lane and I'll be your moderator for today. It's a pleasure to welcome you and thank you for taking time out of your busy day to be with us. We have a great agenda for you today. We'll be offering expert insight into the critical activities and controls you need to put in place to reduce data outsourcing risks and utilize cloud computing with confidence. Specifically, we'll be discussing your responsibilities as a CEO, CIO, or CISO to protect your data, the processes, plans, and controls you can put in place to reduce risk, the key questions to ask your cloud provider before signing on that dotted line, and actionable tips for you to implement right away to improve your cloud security posture. If you'd like to ask any questions during the session, please use the question pane at any time. At the end of the presentation, we'll do a Q&A session and take as many questions as we have time for. Okay, let's get started by introducing Shearwater and today's speakers. Shearwater was established in 2003 as a specialist cybersecurity service provider. Today, we have a presence in all major cities within Australia. Shearwater's expertise includes application security, including penetration testing, security consulting, security operations management, and security education. Our highly developed methodologies enable private and government organisations to implement best security practices and to help them achieve, maintain, and prove compliance against a range of security standards. If you'd like to learn more about our services, please visit our website by going to www.shearwater.com.au. So on to our speakers. Damien Faulkner is the General Manager of Consulting at Shearwater Solutions and has over 29 years of experience in IT. Over the past 6 years, Damien has specialised in information security, much of which has been as a CISO at an ASX-listed technology company. Damien is passionate about pragmatic security, where security adds value to business. He has helped many customers with security strategy development, risk approaches, secure cloud adoption, secure application development, and compliance activities. John Donassis is a principal security consultant at Shearwater Solutions. He has worked in information security for over 10 years and has a breadth of experience in implementing and configuring security technologies. He also has experience in incident response, performing security hardening reviews, and implementing frameworks to help organizations to lift their security posture. John is also an IRAP assessor and was responsible for performing the IRAP assessments on Microsoft Azure and Office 365, which culminated in the appearance on the federal government CSSL list at the protected level, which is quite an undertaking. So without any further delay, I'm going to hand it over to you two gentlemen.
Thank you, Shannon. Well, to give us some context for this presentation, we thought we'd start with a quick poll. We wanted to find out who is using cloud services. So if you're not using cloud services at all, or not that you know of, click A. If you have very few business functions in the cloud, click B. If you're using the cloud for some business functions, click C. And if you're using the cloud extensively for many business functions, click D. We'll just give that a few seconds more for the results to come in. And so what we're seeing there is that most people here are using the cloud in some form, and we've got at least 50% there who are using the cloud quite extensively. So that's good. That's about what we'd expect to see. So I want to start this presentation with a story. Back in 2013, Target in the US were themselves the target of a cyber attack. And during that cyber attack, there was about 100 million credit cards that were stolen, or information for credit cards that was stolen. And they were stolen through the use of Target's use of a particular vendor. That vendor happened to be an air conditioning maintenance company. And that vendor was seen as low-hanging fruit. Target themselves were unaware of the access levels that that vendor had into their network. Now, I can say to you all day that the vendor was responsible, that they were the weak link in the chain, but no one cares because ultimately Target was responsible. Target used an outsourced provider, and that provider cost Target not only a lot of money, but a massive amount of reputational damage, as well as the jobs of the CEO who was sacked over it and the CIO who resigned. Now, whether we're talking service providers like a cloud provider or a service provider, the risks are very similar. Now, most organisations have some pretty sensitive information that they keep about their own business and about their customers. I know I'm not telling you anything that you don't know here, but given that sensitive information that you hold, it can increase your size as a target. And your organisation has the responsibility of due care around your information and your customers' information. And you need to undertake due diligence to ensure its protection. Now, as we've seen, most organisations use the cloud in one or more ways. But to give some context to this presentation, we're going to be talking about, during the presentation, the three different types of cloud models that there are. The first type is software as a service, and this is about supplying user applications as a service for you to subscribe to. Examples of this would be a Salesforce or a Dropbox. Platform as a service is about the cloud provider providing you with an application platform or middleware on which you can build applications. A good example of this would be Microsoft Azure. And the last type, infrastructure as a service, IaaS. And this is about the cloud provider providing you with compute or storage. And good examples of this are Amazon Web Services, Elastic Cloud, or their secure storage service. Now, this presentation is about the security risks of using those different types of cloud models. And I use the term risk quite deliberately because you need to view security in the framework of risk, because ultimately security is just another risk. It's no more or less important than any other risk that you face in your business, but it absolutely needs to be managed like all of those other enterprise risks that you face, be they legal, operational, financial. You can't stick your head in the sand. But the problem with the cloud is the pace of technology is changing so often that it's not something that you can just do once. You need to keep doing that risk assessment process. So how can you secure your data? How can you conduct that due diligence? Well, to answer that, you need to know what are the risks of working with a cloud provider, and more importantly, what can you do to mitigate those risks? But before we talk about those risks, time for another poll. So we'd like to get a sense of what do you see as some of the risks of using cloud services? If you think it's A, your information could get stolen. Is it B, you could lose access to your information? C, could it be accessed by unauthorized people? Or D, is it all of those? So I'll just give that a few seconds for people to put their responses in. So that's good. It was a trick question. It was certainly all of the above. So what we're going to do now is talk about some of these risks in more detail. So there are four broad categories of risk that we're going to be talking about. And as part of that, we'll tell you what you can do to help deal with those risks. So those risk categories, in no particular order, are breach of data, a loss of data, a loss of service, and then insufficient due diligence. I need to point out, though, that they're all related. There's a crossover of the impact that they have on your organisation and also in your response or your mitigation of those risks. So let's start with a breach of data. Now, this is simply about an unauthorised person getting access to or modifying your information. And a very common way for an attacker to get access to your information is through the theft of insecure accounts. And an account is simply what's used to get access to your provider's service. Most providers use a username and password. And attackers can steal those accounts or credentials. For example, Dropbox a few years back were targeted, and there were many hundreds of thousands of millions of accounts that were stolen. Now, if those passwords are compromised, then it gives an attacker a way into your cloud, or can give your attacker a way into your cloud provider. But you may be asking, well, how can stealing details for a Dropbox account get an attacker into another service that you use? Well, if I was an attacker, here's how I would do it. So if I have my list of Dropbox usernames and passwords that I got a few years back, those usernames in that list would generally be domain emails. So they would be corporate email addresses, and they would contain corporate domains. That would give me information as to where you work. I would then go and research that company, look at your website, and that will give me a good idea of obviously the type of function that your business performs, and it will give me a very good idea of the type of cloud services that you may use. So at that point in time, I know what you do. I've got a reasonable guess as to what cloud providers you may be using, and I have your password. But what's your Dropbox password got to do with your cloud password? Well, therein lies a bit of a problem in that many people do tend to reuse passwords across different websites. So I've got a list of cloud providers I can try. I've got a username and I've got a password that I can have a go at trying to crack your cloud provider's account. Data breach can also come about through shared technology risk. And to understand this, you need to look at the commercials of using a cloud provider. Firstly, they have to do it cheaper than you can. And they do this either through reducing cost or increasing revenue. Cloud services, they're scalable and their capacity can be increased quickly and automatically. Now, both of these providers will use infrastructure and applications that can be shared by multiple customers. The risk here is that information from one customer may leak into or be available from another customer's environment. A third type of risk in this category can come about due to a weak cloud configuration or in the way it's deployed. This could be across the cloud model configurations, that the SaaS, the PaaS, or the IaaS I talked about previously, or it could be in how you're configuring your application and deploying it in the cloud. In the last few years, there's been some examples of government agencies, Australian government agencies, and private companies who've had data breached because of their misconfiguration of Amazon Web Services secure storage service buckets. So I'm going to pass over to John, who can take you through what you can do to help mitigate those risks.
Thanks, Damien. So first of all, look for compliance. Understand if the cloud service complies with any security standards. For example, standards such as ISO 27001, PCI, SOC, and NIST. This will give you a certain level of confidence in the underlying security posture of the service. Remember, compliance doesn't always mean secure. However, it is a good reference to a certain level of security posture. It signifies intent in the security of the service. Also, when looking at compliance, don't just look at compliance at a certain point in time. Look for a positive trend in compliance over a period of time, such as 5 years. Look at what certifications, attestations the service has held over this period. Look for security processes. Understand how the cloud provider manages overall security of the cloud platform, the end-to-end security governance they apply to the platform. How do they drive continuous improvement in their service from a security point of view? They may already have this information on their website or in their compliance reports. However, you can also ask questions until you feel you have a sufficient understanding. There are some good online resources you can use to help guide questions. For example, ASD's Cloud Security Guidance for Tenants and the ISO 27001 standard. Look for technical controls. Understand what technical controls are in place by default in the cloud service platform. that help control the risk of data breach. Also, understand what technical controls you may have to configure in the service itself to provide this security. Furthermore, ask the question, how do they know these controls are actually effective? Do they conduct regular penetration tests, which try to compromise the service externally from one tenant to another, plus from an internal threat point of view? On your side, employ account provisioning and deprovisioning processes. Establish processes which only grant accounts to authorized personnel, plus also revoke access in a timely manner for your organization, taking into account the business criticality of the specific assets in question. Employ the least privilege principle. For all accounts from the infrastructure to the application layer where relevant, ensure that accounts only have access to the minimal resources required to complete operations, plus can only perform the required operations, no more. So even in the event that account becomes compromised, the level of access in the cloud is still initially restricted. Employ strong authentication. Strong authentication includes multiple factors when authenticating to the cloud service. This may be something you know, such as a passphrase, something you have, such as a token, or something you are. Make sure you enforce complexity in passphrases. Keep in mind that some cloud service providers include strong authentication services. However, in some cases, you will need to implement this yourself or choose to integrate with a third-party service where possible. Employing incident detection and response processes. Implement controls to log events and detect incidents which relate to the breach of data. Include response processes. In more detail, you should make sure you establish yourself up a process for the incident. You want to build this up just to make sure you're not actually dealing with this the first time an incident actually occurs. Also, it is important that your plan interacts well with the cloud service provider's incident response capability. For example, understand the level of incident response service that is delivered by the cloud provider, what they will monitor and triage versus what you will be required to do. Understand that this will differ between an IaaS to a SaaS platform, even when you consume this from the same provider. Finally, will the cloud provider even notify you of an incident? Stage migration approach. Take a staged migration approach to the cloud. With a staged approach, consider migrating lower priority applications to the cloud first, the applications that have less business criticality for you. Then use lessons learned for when you migrate high priority workloads and applications. Also, embed security into the migration project. This includes security functional tests, penetration tests, event logging, and alerting validation. Finally, employ secure application architecture. It is important to consider the security architecture of your cloud deployment. The following may not be relevant for all deployment options, however, consider what your execution architecture looks like versus your management architecture, such as the segregation of management traffic, employing jump boxes to manage infrastructure. Restricting the network interfaces of each node in the cloud. Do all nodes in your cloud tenancy need to be internet-facing, only, for example, a web server, while the processing and storage tiers being restricted? Will the deployment leverage any of your on-premise security capabilities, such as content filtering and data loss prevention services that you may have in your existing gateway? Finally, take a step back and consider, how for the life of the cloud solution deployment will I be comfortable that the security posture helps prevent a data breach? You can embed security functions into IT cloud administrator operations and also perform regular assessments to understand if the controls are still effective and fit for purpose.
Thanks, John. So that's the first category of risk, breach of data. The second category of risk we're going to look at is loss of data. And this is not just because of theft. It can come about because of loss of access or loss due to jurisdictional laws. So with loss of access, some of you may have heard of CryptoLocker, which is a form of malware that's known as ransomware. If you haven't heard of ransomware, it's a fairly simple and effective business model. A cyber attacker gets into your network, encrypts all your files, and the only way you can get access to those files again is through paying them quite a substantial amount of money. And there's plenty of incidents where crypto locker and variants of have crept into the cloud. And we've seen examples of this. One of them is the following. A user couldn't open an attachment. They sent it to the service desk. The service desk helped them out. They opened that attachment. That attachment had a piece of malware in it, and bang, the crypto locker then propagated throughout the organization. And it did that through looking at drives that were attached to that machine. So it went through network drives, it went through corporate file shares, and because there were some cloud drives that were accessible from that machine, it got onto their cloud share as well. If you haven't seen what happens with crypto locker, that's actually a good thing. But here is an example that you're hoping not to see. And effectively, this is telling you, you have a piece of ransomware here. This is what's done. And if you want to get your files back, you need to pay an amount of money, usually in some form of cryptocurrency. But definitely not something that you want to see. Now, last year in South Korea, there was a firm that got hit by a ransomware attack, and the attacker demanded that they pay quite a substantial ransom. In the end, the only way that that company could get their files back was to pay that ransom. They did negotiate it down to around $1 million, but they still had to pay to get their data back. Another type of loss of data that can come about is due to jurisdictional laws. And to understand that, you need to understand the cloud models. So your data can be stored in one or more countries, even if it's with the same provider. And that country may have rights on your data in certain circumstances. For example, the law in that country may allow law enforcement agencies to subpoena your data to help with criminal investigations. And where there is a law, you can't count on your client cloud provider maintaining your privacy in the face of those government actions. So John will now take you through what you can do to help mitigate those risks.
Thank you, Damien. First of all, know where your data is stored. Understand how the cloud service operates and where your data in the cloud service is stored. Ask, will the data remain within the data centers? Does the service take any backups or perform replication in other cloud instances in other regions as a part of the service? Will your data remain in the same country that the cloud service provider instance is hosted? Then, understand the privacy and data protection laws in those jurisdictions. What can regulatory authorities in that jurisdiction do with your data? If you're dealing with the United States, they are implementing a lot of laws that may impact you, so make sure you keep abreast of this. Search for global data protection laws and leverage legal advice where required. Be aware that some cloud providers also provide information on what law enforcement organizations have requested information in the past, how many times, and against what international locations the cloud service is located in. From your point of view, you can employ backups offline. This is an interesting one. In the event where you have critical business operations that are purely dependent on access to your data, depending on the nature of the cloud service, you should also consider taking an export or an offline backup of critical content that will allow your business to continue and operate in the event where access is lost. Match your export or backup cadence to recovery time and point objectives. Employ security awareness and training. You can also employ security awareness and training to cater for ransomware. Phishing attacks are one of the most common vectors used to promote initial stages of ransomware. Make sure your staff are trained to detect and report these events to allow your organization to act rapidly. Employ encryption. In the event you are concerned about the loss of access to your data, plus access by other authorities under law to your data, consider encrypting your data prior to migrating it or processing in the cloud. Keep in mind that different cloud deployment models may not provide you with this flexibility. Employ a business continuity plan. Have a plan that allows your business to continue when an issue occurs. Consider, how will your critical business operations continue to operate, plus understand how long is tolerable for your organization to keep operating without this access. Then plan accordingly.
Thanks, John. So that was the second category of risk, loss of data. The third category of risk we're going to talk about is loss of service. You may have the strongest controls to stop unauthorised people accessing or modifying your data. But what would happen if you couldn't access it? Now, there are many ways that a loss of service can occur, but two of the more common ones we're going to be talking about are denial of service and abuse of service. So firstly, let me start with a denial of service, or sometimes known as a distributed denial of service. And a denial of service is about exactly that, stopping you from accessing your information. And if you happen to be dealing with a high-profile customer, that may increase your target for a DDoS attack. Equally, if you're using a high-profile cloud provider, you can also get caught in the crossfire here as well. With an abusive service, this is mostly an issue for the provider because services themselves are not just used by legitimate businesses. An abuse may result in your service getting blocked. But why? Well, this is analogous to the electricity company cutting off electricity in your street because of the nefarious activities that your neighbour is performing. And because of the way providers can configure your services may reside in the same street as the bad guys. So, John, what can you do?
Thanks, Damien. First of all, ask how your cloud service provider deals with denial of service attacks. Understand if there are any limitations to this capability. For example, do their DOS mitigations only protect the underlying infrastructure, where you may need to implement specific controls for an application you have migrated on their IaaS platform? Understand, will you be notified when they detect and act on a DOS attack? And finally, understand what commercial guarantee the cloud service provider commits to, for example, 99% uptime. Ask how your cloud service provider deals with cloud service abuse. Specifically, try and understand, will they notify you if they become aware of service abuse? What actions will they take, such as shutting down a VM or access to a subscription? And importantly, understand how service abuse from another tenant on the same cloud infrastructure can impact you. On your side, what can you do? You can employ business continuity plans. Based on your understanding of the service and how the cloud service provider will act on loss of service events, map out what you need to do to maintain continuity for your key business operations. Employ backups offline. As previously mentioned, one option, depending on the criticality of your business, is that you can consider maintaining an export of key data or taking an offline backup to cater for the loss of a service event. Employ defense in depth architecture. Architect your applications and workloads in the cloud using defense in depth. Some of the following suggestions are more relevant to an IaaS model consumed than SaaS, such as limiting services which are internet facing, implementing load balancing and high availability, and using technologies that allow you to detect, monitor, and act rapidly when a loss of service occurs.
Thanks, John. So that's loss of service. The last category of risk that we're going to look at is about insufficient due diligence. It's not enough consideration given to the potential impact that the use of that cloud service may have on your organisation. And ultimately, that's the purpose of this presentation. It can come about because of a misunderstanding between you and the provider as to how your services and data are protected. What you're trying to do here is minimise the unknown unknowns. So, time for our last poll before we talk about due diligence. Who here has ever read the terms of service for a cloud provider? Do you A, do it every time? B, have you done it occasionally, once, and that was enough, no more? Or D, never, they're just too long to read? I'll just give that a few seconds to look at, for people to type in their responses. That's, I've got to say, that result is quite good. There's quite a percentage of you that do read it every time. That is very good. And I can absolutely understand the never, because some of them are very, very long and very, very legalese. So what can you do to help understand the due diligence and help go through that due diligence?
Thank you, Damien. So first of all, you can conduct a risk assessment. What we mean here is consider all the information previously collected from questions asked, understanding how the service operates, and what you will implement as an organisation. Then, consider if these risks actually do play out, and with controls in place to help recover, is this tolerable to the organisation? Take action from here as required. Ask questions. Ask questions and keep asking until you're comfortable, or at least you understand the consequences. You can and you should do this with every provider you deal with. There are different online sources to help you with, such as the Cloud Security Alliance questionnaire, as previously mentioned, ASD's guidance for cloud security tenants. Also, make sure you understand if the cloud service you consume, such as SaaS, is actually hosted on a separate provider's IaaS service. Understand how supply chain risk can actually impact you. Understand your baseline security requirements. Make sure you understand security requirements you'll need to apply to your cloud tenancy. Understand what the cloud provider delivers out of the box. Understand what the service includes that you can actually configure. And finally, understand what additional security controls you will need to implement. Agree and document responsibilities. In many cases, the cloud provider will remain static in their terms of responsibilities that they actually offer. Make sure you understand the responsibilities they commit to, allowing you to close the gap with the responsibilities you need to bring to the table. Provide that end-to-end security coverage. Leverage service agreements, RASI matrices, and operational procedures as required. Mobilize your operations. Many organizations may not be ready to consume and operate from cloud services. Consider implementing incident detection, response, a log correlation capability which accounts for on-premise and cloud deployments. Consider cloud service training for your personnel who administer the cloud service, including how to harden the service. Consider integrating your service management model to include the cloud deployment, such as access, release, and change management. Consider implementing governance over transferring your data to the cloud, as the service may only be fit for purpose to handle certain types of information your organization holds. Establish and communicate data transfer policies and procedures.
Thanks, John. So that was insufficient due diligence. So let's just look briefly at the 4 risk categories at a high level we've talked about. Breach of data, loss of service, and insufficient due diligence. And to summarise those actions that John talked about, baseline your security controls and understand what your cloud provider brings to the table. But make sure you have a clear understanding of what are your minimum security controls. Be aware of relevant laws in the jurisdictions that your cloud provider operates in and where your data is located. Make sure both you and your provider are clear about what is your responsibility and what is their responsibility. And have a plan. Have a plan for when things go wrong, whether that's a business continuity plan at a business level event, or whether it's simply a small incident. Make sure you have an incident response plan. Have a migration plan for migrating information across to the cloud, an exit plan if you need one at a later point. And the most important thing is to conduct a risk assessment. Understand what are the risks that cloud provider is going to introduce to your organisation. But before we finish up, there is one more thing. Last year, the federal government brought in the mandatory disclosure laws, and they came into being in this year. Now, they apply to federal government agencies and businesses and not-for-profits with an annual turnover of greater than $3 million. And if that's you, and you suffer an eligible data breach, that is, personal information is lost or stolen, or it's suspected of being lost or stolen, then you have to notify the Australian Privacy Commissioner. Now, the cloud provider may not need to notify you, but you need to notify your customers. So you need to have that conversation with your cloud provider and understand what it is they will do in the event that they detect a breach. So when I talk about eligible data breach, it really comes down to the risk of serious harm that data can cause. You can look at the law reform website for more details on what constitutes serious harm, but ultimately, if it does, you need to notify the Privacy Commissioner. If you don't, then you may be potentially up for quite a sum of money. So let me just, in conclusion, bring it all together. Well, your providers are a critical part of your business, but because of that, they're also a critical part of your risk. And so when you're using their services, remember, security is just another risk, but you absolutely have to treat it like you would treat any other enterprise risk that your organization faces. Make sure you have a plan for when things go wrong. Regardless of the vendor, you can ask them about their security posture and look in the mirror. Understand what is your security posture. What are you willing to accept and what are you not willing to accept? Be aware of the relevant laws in the jurisdictions that hold your data, both data and privacy laws in those jurisdictions. And lastly, ensure that you and your cloud provider are clear about your mutual responsibilities. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. We've got a bit of time now for questions. Happy to open it up to the floor.
Thank you, Damien and John. That's fantastic. Look, we do have a couple of questions that have already come through, so thank you for supplying those. The first question that's come through is, can you recommend the best cloud security checklist to help with a risk assessment?
Yep, Shannon, that's a good question. We use a couple, and there are quite a few out there. The one we tend to use quite a lot is the Australian Signals Directorate Cloud Computing Security for Tenants. Now, although it's written for government, it actually applies quite a lot to private organisations. And that checklist itself is effectively a set of questions that you as a tenant should pose to your cloud provider. So that's one that I'd recommend. It's freely available. It's on ASD's website. If you just do a search for it, you'll find it fairly easily. But there are others there.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Damien. This next question, I've got to say, I love this. It's a cracking question. How much, and a fairly pointed one at that, how much bargaining power do I really have when dealing with those hyperscale providers?
It's a very good question. It depends a lot on how much money you're going to send their way. If you're a very large company with lots of money to give them, you may have quite a bit of leverage. But ultimately, for most of us, you don't tend to have a lot of bargaining power. But if you understand their model, then that gives you a good bit of information. And what I mean by that is that their model depends on their reputation. You're not going to use their services if you're worried about their reputation and your data. So it depends on their reputation, and their reputation depends on their security. So generally, you will find most cloud providers will have that information, good information on their security up on their website. So have a look for that. But look, it's always worth reaching out to those providers anyway. They may be able to do something for you, but it is generally, it's generally one size fits all.
Okay, that's great. So I guess what I'm hearing there is, whilst you may not have a lot of bargaining power, you know, the good practices around risk management and understanding what's provided and what's not is a good starting point.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, that's great. And look, we've got one other question, that's actually two questions, I should say. What should I do if a cloud provider won't show me what they do from a security perspective?
I'm going to leave that one to John.
Thanks, Damien and Shannon. So a couple of different things. So first of all, this could be an indication of their level of maturity. But outside of that, do your research. For example, have a look online to understand what the product actually offers, but also actually reach out and try and contact other organizations who may be using the same cloud provider. Another thing you may like to consider is also looking at a trial tenancy. So you have an opportunity to actually play with the cloud tenancy and understand the security configuration and controls that actually could be in place.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. Look, we do have another question that's just popped in around the recording of this particular webinar. And look, what we will do is certainly make that available. I'll come to that in a moment. Are there any other questions at the moment, or are we all fairly happy? Okay, great. Look, for me today, thank you, gentlemen. That was a great webinar, and I really appreciate your effort there. It was a great surprise also that 31% of people do read all their T's and C's for a cloud environment. That's a lot more than I thought would be relevant, but that's great. And look, we do have one more question that just popped in. We outsource our development. The team has a blind confidence in a particular hyperscale vendor. I won't mention who. And what breaches have they had and how to handle them? Well, look, what we can talk about is in generic terms. We can get in touch around that specific hyperscale vendor and provide some insight there. But in terms of the breaches, is there any insight you can provide generally?
Yeah, look, so a couple of things there. I'll start off, and John may want to kick in here as well. There's actually a few good websites around that will tell you what breaches have occurred in the history of the internet. They go back quite a long way, and they'll give you a sense of size and scale and who they are as well. They're quite open about that. If you do a search for cloud breaches, you'll find those. There's a good infographic site there as well. So definitely worth checking that out, because obviously the cloud provider themselves are not going to tell you they've had breaches, but in today's society, it's fairly transparent. When there's a breach, you find out about it fairly quick, and obviously that news is available on the web anyway. So certainly do some research in that regard. And then go and have a look at their security posture. Look at those documents again and see how they're addressing those particular breaches that they've had.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Damien. All right, look, if that's it from a question and answer session, we might draw it to a close there. We'd like to thank you all very much for attending today's session. If you can spare the time, please help us create better webinars in the future by completing a short survey at the end of this session. Please also let us know what you'd like to see in terms of topic list for next time around. We do offer these fairly regularly, so we'd be more than happy to respond to your requirements there. In terms of what will happen from here, everyone who attended today will receive a copy of the recording via email. That should occur tomorrow at some stage. And we'll also be posting this webinar on our website for everybody to access it. One thing that Damien did also mention during the course of the webinar was around the data breach legislation. We do have a series of blog posts that are available on our website if you want to look more into that, and feel free to use that resource. So without any further delay, I'd like to thank you again very much for attending today, and wish you a very great day. Thank you.